18th, 1980. 8:32 on a Sunday morning in southwest Washington, the north face of Mount St. Helens. A slab over a mile wide breaks loose and slides away. Mountains are not supposed to do that.
Now we've got an eruption down here. Now we've got a big slide coming off. Coming up over the ridge towards me. I'm going to back out of here.
6 miles north, on a ridge the science called safe, a 30-year-old geologist named David Johnston gets 5 words into his radio. That blast is a wall of rock and gas, 600 degrees racing flat across the ground near the speed of sound. It bursts from the mountain's open side and flattens everything in its path.
It looked like the start of World War III. It was Mount St. Helens volcano in Washington state exploding with such force today that it was felt more than 100 miles away.
6 miles is not far enough. 57 people will die this morning. Almost all are standing where they were told they could stand.
My God, I didn't realize how badly I wanted to live. I just can't describe it. It's pitch black. Just pitch black. This is hell on earth I'm walking through.
South of me is covered. It's going to get me too. Get out of here.
This is the story of the deadliest eruption in modern American history. Mount St. Helens had been silent for 123 years. In March of 1980, it woke up. On March 20th, a magnitude 4.0 earthquake rattled the peak, the first sign that magma was on the move beneath it. A week later, the summit blew open a crater and began venting steam. Through April, the earthquakes came by the dozens every day, and helicopters full of geologists, reporters, and sightseers circled a mountain that had turned, almost overnight, into the most closely watched volcano on Earth. Then, the north face started to move.
A bulge noticed earlier on the north-northeast flank of the mountain near Goat Rocks was found to be moving north-northwest at about 5 feet a day.
Survey crews measured a bulge growing out of the mountainside, a dome of rock more than a mile across, shoved outward by magma rising inside the peak. It grew 5 to 6 feet per day. By the middle of May, it stood more than 400 feet out of line. One of the USGS scientists monitoring it, a 30-year-old volcanologist named David Johnston, compared the mountain to a keg of dynamite with the fuse already lit. The state drew a restricted zone around the volcano and closed it. Johnston's data, and his insistence, helped keep it closed against loud and growing pressure from cabin owners and a timber industry that wanted back in. By mid-May, the standoff had been running for weeks, scientists warning that the north face could fail at any hour, and a public that had watched the mountain steam and rumble for 2 months without doing anything worse. The fear was wearing off. On May 17th, officials relented far enough to escort one convoy of property owners in to collect their belongings. A second convoy was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning.
We're paying taxes and we'd like to use our property. I'm not afraid.
The mountain went at 8:32. At 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, David Johnston radios in his measurements from Coldwater 2, an observation post on a ridge 6 miles north of the summit. Nothing unusual. The bulge is creeping outward at the same steady rate it has held for weeks. The sky over the mountain is clear. He had taken the shift only 13 hours earlier, covering for a colleague who was needed elsewhere. 6 miles felt like distance. 6 miles was the edge of what the science of 1980 believed a volcano could reach. At 8:32:11 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake fires directly beneath the north flank. For a few seconds, the mountain holds. Then the entire bulging face, 3/4 of a cubic mile of rock and glacier ice, shears loose and slides towards Spirit Lake. It is the largest landslide ever recorded on land. And that sliding mountainside is also a cork coming out of a bottle. The magma inside the peak had been pinned down by the sheer weight of the mountainside sitting on top of it. With that weight suddenly gone, the gas locked in the molten rock flashes free all at once, and the volcano detonates through the open wound in its side. The blast fires north, horizontally, straight over the top of the landslide that freed it. It leaves the mountain at around 220 miles per hour and accelerates to nearly 670, approaching the speed of sound. The cloud behind it is 660 degrees Fahrenheit. It overtakes the fastest thing in the valley, which is the landslide itself, and then it starts catching everything else. There is no siren for something like this, and there would have been no point. And because the cloud is moving at nearly the speed of sound, across much of the valley, it arrives with its own thunder still somewhere behind it. At Coldwater 2, 6 miles out, the blast is seconds from the ridge where David Johnston stands.
Vancouver! Vancouver! Mr. Dick!
His warning is already on its way to Vancouver, the last anyone will hear from Coldwater II. The blast crosses the ridge in about a minute. What the blast does to the land north of the mountain has no precedent anywhere in the United States. Closest to the volcano, the forest simply ceases to exist. 100-foot Douglas firs torn out of the ground whole and carried away. Further out, to a distance of 17 miles, the trees snap at the base and fall in combed rows, millions of them, all pointing away from the mountain like iron filings around a magnet. When it is over, 230 square miles of forest are lying flat. Pilots flying over the ridges that afternoon describe whole valleys that look like they've been swept with a broom. Then the vertical eruption begins. With its side torn open, the volcano drives an ash column boiling into the sky, 80,000 feet in under 15 minutes, and holds it there for more than 9 hours. The plume rolls east across Washington.
I just can't describe it. It's pitch black. Just pitch black. This is hell on earth I'm walking through. I can hear the mountain behind me rumbling. It's an enormous mud and water slide came down and washed out the road.
In Yakima, 90 miles away, the streetlights come on at mid-morning. In Spokane, visibility drops to 10 feet in the middle of the day. Ash falls across 11 states, and the finest of it circles the entire planet in 15 days. The mountain is still not finished. Its glaciers, the ice that had capped the peak for centuries, melt into the eruption, and the water mixes with loose rock into lahars, volcanic mud flows with the consistency of wet concrete. They pour down the river valleys west of the mountain, swallowing bridges and homes as they go. 90 minutes after the eruption, a wall of mud 12 feet high is moving down the river valleys, 27 miles from the mountain. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it is pushing past Castle Rock on the Cowlitz River, more than 40 miles out, a river running the wrong texture, gray and thick, carrying whole log decks and the wreckage of houses. The mud rides all the way to the Columbia, the Pacific Northwest's main shipping channel, and chokes it closed to ocean freighters. Geologists will later put the energy released that morning at 24 megatons of TNT. The summit of Mount St. Helens, the top 1,300 feet of one of the most photographed peaks in America, is gone. A mountain that stood 9,677 feet tall at breakfast measures 8,363 by the time the ash clears enough to see it. And nearly all of that violence lands on ground the official maps had called safe. The blast zone that morning holds loggers, campers, scientists, and photographers. 57 of them do not come out. Robert Landsberg is a 48-year-old photographer who has spent weeks documenting the volcano's slow-motion threat. On the morning of May 18th, he is parked a few miles west of the summit with his camera when the north face collapses. He does what he came to do. He shoots, frame after frame, as the cloud boils outward and fills more and more of his viewfinder. Somewhere in those final frames, the picture stops being a photograph of an eruption and becomes a photograph of the thing that is about to reach him. Landsberg understands this. He spends his last minute on the film instead of himself. He rewinds the roll back into its canister, seals the camera in his bag, and lies down on top of the pack, shielding it with his body. Searchers find him 17 days later, under the ash. The film survives, and it develops. The frames Robert Landsberg protected, a wall of ash swallowing the sky, are among the only close-range images of the lateral blast ever taken. Geologists study them to this day. Reed Blackburn, a 27-year-old newspaper photographer manning a camera post for National Geographic and the USGS, is caught at Coldwater 1, 8 miles from the summit. His camera is recovered too. The film is ruined. On the shore of Spirit Lake, the eruption takes Harry Truman, an 83-year-old lodge owner who had lived on that shoreline for 52 years and who had spent the spring telling every reporter in America that the mountain would never hurt him. He stays with his 16 cats. The lodge, the shoreline, and the man are buried under 150 feet of debris. Of the 57 people who die on May 18th, Truman is the only one inside the restricted zone without permission. David Johnston's body is never found. 13 years later, a road crew cutting through the debris turns up pieces of his USGS trailer. The ridge where Coldwater 2 stood carries his name now, Johnston Ridge. His colleagues have lived with the arithmetic ever since. The man whose warnings helped keep the public off the mountain is one of the people it killed, 6 miles from the summit. 57 dead, most of them asphyxiated by the ash cloud. More than $1 billion in damage, over $3.5 billion in today's money. 230 square miles of forest flattened in minutes, and a set of official maps that had to answer for all of it. Because here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of May 18th. Nearly all of the dead were outside the restricted zone, on roads, ridges, and campsites the state had left open. Journalists and historians who later reconstructed the decision-making found that the zone had been drawn tight around the summit less by science than by politics. Much of the land in the blast path belonged to a timber company, and closing it was a fight no one in the state government wanted. An order extending the zone was sitting on Governor Dixie Lee Ray's desk, unsigned, on the morning the mountain erupted.
It seemed to me that was a quite reasonable thing to do, and far better than simply closing the area and saying all those people could no longer earn a living.
The only reason the toll stopped at 57 is the calendar. It was a Sunday. On any working day, hundreds of loggers would have been cutting timber inside the blast area, with permission. What changed afterward changed for good. 2 years after the eruption, the USGS opened a permanent volcano observatory in Vancouver, Washington, the Cascades Volcano Observatory, dedicated to David Johnston. The United States built a standing volcano alert system modeled on the National Weather Service's storm warnings, and Mount St. Helens became the most closely monitored volcano in the Cascades. Scientists who study lateral blasts today do it in large part with data that came off this mountain, including the frames from a roll of film that a photographer chose to protect instead of himself. In 1980, the maps drew a circle around the summit of Mount St. Helens and called everything outside it safe. The mountain exploded sideways. Every person watching this video helps keep stories like these alive. Whether you've been here since the beginning or just found the channel today, thank you for being part of this community. If you'd like to help us reach even more people, consider subscribing or sharing this documentary. We'll see you in the next one.